The silence in the lawyer's office was heavier than a tombstone. It pressed down on us, suffocating the air, making every tick of the grandfather clock in the corner sound like a hammer blow against an anvil. My son-in-law Richard, a man who had always moved through the world with the unearned confidence of a king, was staring at the document on the mahogany desk as if it were written in a dead language he was suddenly, cruelly, expected to understand. His face, usually a mask of smug amusement, had gone slack, the color draining from it until it resembled spoiled milk. This can't be right, he stammered, his voice a pathetic, reedy thing I had never heard before. He looked from the papers to my lawyer, Mr. Davies, and then finally to me. His eyes, which had so often dismissed me with a casual glance, were now wide, with a frantic, begging panic. I simply looked back at him. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I let the weight of my 71 years settle around me, not as a burden of age, but as a suit of armor forged in pain and patience. "Oh, it's right, Richard," I said, my own voice steady, calm, and as clear as a winter morning. "It's been right for a year now. You just didn't know it." To understand how we arrived in that suffocating room, you have to go back a year to a different kind of silence. The silence of a home that no longer felt like one. It had been 3 years since my Eleanor, my wife of 45 years, had passed away. The house we had built together, the one filled with the ghosts of laughter and the scent of her rose garden, had become a hollow vessel of memory. The silence in its rooms was a constant, aching reminder of what I had lost. My daughter, Clara, and her husband, Richard, had seen my grief, or at least they had seen my solitude. "Dad, it's too much for you," Clara had said, her hand on my arm, her expression a careful mixture of concern and persuasion. "This big house, all alone, why don't you sell it? You can move in with us. We'll get a bigger place. A family home. You can help with Leo, be there to watch him grow up. It's what Mom would have wanted." Richard had nodded in solemn agreement, his arm around Clara's shoulder. "We're family, Arthur. We look after our own. Your money from the sale can be the down payment. We'll all be together. It makes perfect sense." And in my fog of sorrow, it did seem to make sense. The thought of being surrounded by family, of hearing the pitter-patter of my grandson Leo's feet instead of the echo of my own lonely footsteps, was a powerful anesthetic for a grieving heart. I wanted to believe in the warmth they offered. I needed to. So I agreed. I sold the house that held every important memory of my adult life. I signed over a significant portion of the proceeds, a sum that represented a lifetime of careful work and saving, to them for the down payment on a sprawling new house in a manicured suburb. I moved into a guest suite on the ground floor, bringing with me only a few boxes of books, my clothes, and a framed photograph of Eleanor that I placed on my nightstand. For the first year, it was acceptable. I fell into a routine. I made breakfast for Leo every morning. I picked him up from school. I helped him with his homework. I was the live-in grandfather, the unpaid babysitter, the quiet old man in the corner. I contributed my entire pension check to the household expenses, a fact Richard acknowledged with a curt nod each month, as if I were paying rent for the privilege of breathing their air. I told myself it was worth it. Seeing Leo's bright, curious face every day was a balm. He had Eleanor's eyes, and sometimes, when he laughed, I could hear a faint echo of her own joy. But slowly, imperceptibly at first, the atmosphere began to change. The chill started with Richard. He was a man who measured worth in dollars and status. He was a junior partner at a finance firm and carried himself with an air of importance that far exceeded his actual accomplishments. I was a retired carpenter, a man who had worked with his hands, and in Richard's world, that made me simple, uncouth, a relic. His comments began as subtle digs, coated in a thin veneer of humor. "Don't hog the remote, Arthur. The stock market report is on. You probably wouldn't understand it anyway." Or, "Clara, did your dad have to wear that old sweater to Leo's school play? It looks like something he insulated a wall with." I absorbed the barbs in silence, for Clara's sake. I saw the way she would flinch, the quick, worried glance she would shoot in my direction. She was caught in the middle, and I didn't want to make her life more difficult. I would just retreat to my room, look at Eleanor's picture, and ask her for strength. "He doesn't mean it," I would tell myself. "It's just his way." But his way grew colder, more brazen. The house was his kingdom, and I was merely a serf living on his charity, despite the fact my life savings were embedded in the very foundation of the building. He began having lavish dinner parties with his work colleagues, people with slick hair and expensive watches who spoke loudly about portfolios and acquisitions. During these events, I was expected to make myself scarce. Once, I came out to get a glass of water and overheard Richard's nephew Julian, a younger, even more arrogant version of his uncle, ask who I was. "Oh, that's just Clara's old man," Richard had said, his voice dripping with condescension. "He lives here. Don't worry, he's harmless." Harmless. The word stung more than any overt insult. It rendered me invisible, insignificant. I was no longer Arthur, the man who had raised a daughter, loved a wife, and built a life. I was an object, a piece of furniture that occasionally moved. The real conflict, the one that would shatter the fragile peace, began over a renovation. Richard, having secured a promotion, decided the house needed a prestige upgrade. He unveiled a set of architectural plans for a massive extension, a new home gym, a wine cellar, and a state-of-the-art home theater. The cost was astronomical. "How are we going to pay for this, Richard?" Clara asked, her voice tight with anxiety, as she looked over the blueprints spread across the dining table. "Don't you worry about that," he said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I've been managing our assets. We have the capital." Something in his tone made my blood run cold. I had kept a separate savings account, a nest egg I had carefully guarded. It was the remainder of the money from my house sale, and I had earmarked it for Leo's college education. I had discussed it with Clara and Richard, and they had agreed it was a sacred fund, never to be touched. "Richard," I began, my voice quiet but firm, "that money, the money I set aside for Leo, you haven't touched that, have you?" He turned to me, and for the first time, the mask of civility dropped entirely. His eyes were hard, like polished stones. "Our finances are our business, Arthur. It's all one pot. Your money, our money. It's being put to good use, to increase the value of this property. It's an investment." "That's not an investment. That's a wine cellar," I retorted, my voice rising despite my best efforts to control it. "That money is for my grandson's future, not for your toys. We had an agreement." "Agreements change," he sneered. "Things change. This is my house, and I'll decide how money is spent in it." "Your house?" I was on my feet now, my hands trembling. "I paid for half of this house." "You made a contribution," he shot back, his voice rising to a shout. "A contribution for which you've been repaid with free room and board for 3 years. Do you have any idea what it costs to support another person? The food, the bills, the space you take up. You're a constant drain on our resources." Clara stood frozen between us, her face pale. "Richard, please!" But he was beyond reasoning with. The rage he had kept simmering just below the surface had finally boiled over. He took a step toward me, his finger jabbing the air. "I'm sick of it, Arthur. I'm sick of tiptoeing around you. I'm sick of your dusty books and your disapproving looks. This is a young family's home. It's our time. You've had yours." My grandson Leo, drawn by the shouting, had appeared in the doorway. He was 7 years old, holding a small toy car, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He looked at his father, then at me, and his lower lip began to tremble. Seeing him there broke something inside me. All the fight went out of me, replaced by a profound, chilling shame. This was what my life had become, a shouting match in front of a terrified child, in a house I had paid for but could no longer call my own. Richard saw Leo too, but it didn't soften him. It seemed to spur him on to a final, brutal act of cruelty. He lowered his voice, but it was laced with a venom that was worse than his shouting. "This is our house, old man," he said, his words precise and deliberate. "Clara and I have talked. We need the space. Your suite would make a perfect office for me. We think it's time you found somewhere else to live, someplace more appropriate for your age." I looked at Clara. Her eyes were filled with tears, but she wouldn't meet my gaze. She just stared at the floor, her silence a sharp, painful betrayal. She was letting this happen. She was choosing him over me. "You have a week," Richard said, the final words falling like a judge's gavel. "A week to pack your things and go." He then turned, grabbed Clara's arm, and steered her out of the room, leaving me standing there with my little grandson. The silence that fell was the most terrible of all. Leo took a hesitant step toward me and wrapped his small arms around my leg. "Don't go, Grandpa," he whispered, his voice muffled against my trousers. I reached down and stroked his hair, my old, calloused hand shaking. I couldn't speak. My throat was a knot of grief and rage. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark of my room, the expensive, sterile room that had never felt like mine, and I looked at the picture of Eleanor. Her smile seemed to mock me, a reminder of a time when I was respected, loved, and master of my own home. The anger, when it came, was not a hot, explosive thing. It was a cold, quiet clarity. It settled deep in my bones. I had been a fool. I had mistaken dependence for love and tolerance for respect. I had allowed myself to be diminished step by step until I was nothing. I would not be their victim. I would not be the pathetic old man they cast aside. A week, I wouldn't give them the satisfaction. In the pre-dawn gloom, I moved with a quiet purpose I hadn't felt in years. I packed one small suitcase. My best suit, a few changes of clothes, my toiletries, and the books from my nightstand. I took the photograph of Eleanor and carefully wrapped it in a sweater. I looked around the room at the life I had tried to build here and felt nothing but the urge to escape. On the kitchen counter, I left a short, simple note. "I'm gone. Don't look for me." I didn't say goodbye to Clara. I couldn't. I crept into Leo's room and watched him sleep for a moment, his small chest rising and falling in the soft glow of his nightlight. I resisted the urge to wake him, to hug him one last time. It would only cause him more pain. Instead, I left his favorite book, a collection of adventure stories we often read together, on the pillow beside his head. Then, with my single suitcase in hand, I walked out the front door of the house my money had bought, and I didn't look back. The cool morning air felt like a baptism. I was 70 years old, homeless, and stripped of my family. But as I walked down the silent, tree-lined street towards a future I couldn't yet see, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt free. And I made a quiet, solemn promise to myself and to the memory of my wife. This was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The first few days were a blur of logistics and loneliness. I used my laptop at a public library to find a small, furnished apartment on the other side of the city. It was a tiny place on the third floor of a walk-up, with mismatched furniture and windows that looked out onto a brick wall. The smell of stale cooking and disinfectant hung in the air. After the spacious, pristine prison Richard had built, this cramped, anonymous box felt like a palace of freedom. The silence here was different from the silence at Eleanor's house or at Clara's. It wasn't filled with ghosts or with tension. It was simply empty. For the first time in my adult life, I was utterly, completely alone. The solitude was a physical weight. I would wake up in the mornings to the sound of traffic instead of Leo's chatter. I would make coffee for one. The days stretched before me, vast and unstructured. There were moments when a wave of despair would wash over me, so powerful it threatened to pull me under. I would sit in the lumpy armchair, stare at the brick wall, and wonder if Richard had been right. Maybe I was just a used-up old man with nothing left to offer. But then I would look at Eleanor's photograph, which I had placed on the rickety little table that served as my desk. Her smile, which had once seemed to mock me, now seemed to offer encouragement. Eleanor had been a fighter. She had faced down illness with a courage that had humbled me. She had never backed down from a challenge, and she had never tolerated disrespect from anyone. What would she think of me, hiding in this drab little room, feeling sorry for myself? The thought sparked a different feeling, not despair, but a slow, burning anger. It was the same cold, clear anger I had felt on my last night in that house. It was a fuel. To keep the darkness at bay, I started to walk. I walked for hours every day, exploring the unfamiliar city streets. I learned the routes of the buses, the names of the shopkeepers, the best place to get a cheap, hot cup of coffee. The anonymity of the crowds was a comfort. I was no longer Clara's old man. I was just another face in the city, a man with his own thoughts and his own purpose, even if that purpose was not yet clear to me. During those long walks, my mind began to work. Freed from the oppressive atmosphere of Richard's home, I started to look back, not with the rosy tint of nostalgia, but with the harsh, unforgiving clarity of hindsight. I replayed scenes from the past 3 years, moments I had previously dismissed or ignored. I remembered the day I signed the papers for the house. Richard had rushed me through it. "It's all standard, Arthur. Just sign here and here." I was still deep in grief over Eleanor, and my mind was clouded. I had trusted him. He was my son-in-law, my daughter's husband. Why wouldn't I? I remembered his hand guiding mine, his pen feeling slick and foreign in my grasp. What had I actually signed? I had assumed it was just for the transfer of funds for the down payment. Now, a cold dread began to seep into my heart. What if it was more than that? I remembered conversations about my finances. Richard, with his background in asset management, had offered to help me organize my portfolio after Eleanor died. "These old-fashioned savings accounts are earning you nothing, Arthur," he'd said with an air of profound wisdom. "You need to make your money work for you. Let me handle it. I can get you a much better return." I had been reluctant, but Clara had urged me to accept. "He knows about this stuff, Dad. He just wants to help." So I had let him. I had given him access, believing he was acting in my best interest, in the family's best interest. I would get periodic statements he'd prepared himself, simple printouts showing steady, impressive growth. I never questioned them. I never thought to ask for official bank records. The trust I had placed in him was absolute. What a fool I had been. The pattern was so clear now, it was sickening. Every smile, every offer of help, every piece of financial advice, it had all been part of a long, patient con. He hadn't just seen me as a freeloader to be discarded. He had seen me as a resource to be plundered from the very beginning. The humiliation of being kicked out was only the surface wound. The real injury was the deep, calculated betrayal that lay beneath. He hadn't just stolen my home, he had likely stolen my future, and the future I had planned for my grandson. The thought of Leo galvanized me. The despair vanished, replaced by a steely resolve. This wasn't just about my wounded pride anymore. This was about justice. It was about protecting the legacy Eleanor and I had worked our entire lives to build. It was about ensuring that Richard's greed did not rob my grandson of his opportunities. My walks became more purposeful. I found a branch of my bank and went inside. The simple act of walking through the doors felt like a declaration of war. I was no longer a passive victim. I was an investigator. "I'd like to get complete official statements for all of my accounts, going back 4 years, I told the young woman behind the counter. She was polite, but seemed confused. 4 years, sir? We can usually just print the last 12 months. "I need all of them," I insisted, my voice firmer than I intended. "And I need a list of any and all persons with power of attorney or signatory authority on my accounts." She tapped at her keyboard, her brow furrowed. After a few minutes, she looked up, her expression guarded. "It will take some time to compile all of that, sir. We can mail it to you." "I'll wait," I said. I sat on a hard plastic chair in the corner of the bank for over an hour. People came and went. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. With every passing minute, my anxiety grew, but so did my determination. Finally, the young woman called my name. She handed me a thick manila envelope. "There's also this, sir," she said, handing me a separate photocopied document. "The power of attorney form you requested." I thanked her and walked out of the bank, the envelope feeling as heavy as a brick in my hands. I didn't open it on the street. I walked back to my small apartment, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I closed the door, sat down at the rickety table, and took a deep, steadying breath. Then I opened the envelope. First, I looked at the power of attorney. It was dated just 2 months after Eleanor's death. It was a durable power of attorney, giving the holder sweeping powers over my financial and legal affairs. It gave him the right to buy, sell, and manage property, to access bank accounts, to make investments, all in my name. I stared at my own signature at the bottom. It was shaky, unfamiliar. I remembered that day now. Richard had come over with a stack of papers he claimed were for settling Eleanor's estate. "Just a few more formalities, Arthur." I had signed where he told me to sign, my mind lost in a haze of grief. He had tricked me. He had used my darkest moment to seize control of my life. My hands shaking with rage, I tore open the larger envelope containing the bank statements. I spread them out on the table, Years of my financial life laid bare. I ignored the simple, reassuring statements Richard had given me and focused on the official documents from the bank. It didn't take long to find the first discrepancy, a withdrawal of $20,000, just 6 months after I had moved in with them. The memo line read, "Investment capital." I never authorized it, then another, for $30,000, and another. Soon, I was looking at a torrent of transactions, a systematic draining of my life savings. The money wasn't going into blue-chip stocks or secure bonds. The statements showed transfers to high-risk speculative funds, to companies I had never heard of, and, most damningly, to a numbered account that I recognized as one Richard had boasted about opening for his personal ventures. I worked through the night, a pot of bitter coffee my only companion. With a ruler and a red pen, I circled every suspicious transaction. I made notes in the margins. The sun was coming up, casting a pale gray light into my small room when I finally reached the last page. The nest egg for Leo's education, a sum of over $100,000, was gone. Every last cent. It had been transferred out in a single transaction a year ago to a holding company that, after a quick search on my laptop, I found was registered to Richard himself. But the final, most devastating discovery was what he had done with the rest of my capital. The statements showed a series of catastrophic losses from his investments. He hadn't just stolen my money, he had gambled it away on reckless schemes, trying to make a quick fortune. He had used my life savings as his personal slush fund and his private casino. The total amount missing, stolen, or squandered was staggering. It was nearly $500,000. I leaned back in my chair, the papers spread before me like the wreckage of a shipwreck. The sheer scale of the betrayal was breathtaking. He had hollowed me out, taken everything he could, and then, when the well was running dry, he had cast me out onto the street like a piece of trash. The grief I felt was sharp and profound, but it was quickly consumed by something else. A cold, hard fire was lit in the pit of my stomach. The sadness was gone. The self-pity was gone. All that remained was a singular, crystalline purpose. He thought I was a harmless old man. He thought I was weak, senile, and defeated. And he had underestimated me. He had mistaken my kindness for stupidity and my grief for weakness. He was about to find out how wrong he was. I wasn't just going to get my money back, I was going to take back my life, and I was going to dismantle his piece by piece. My mission for justice had just begun. The first step was to find a weapon. In this war, my weapon would be the law. I knew I couldn't fight Richard on his turf of finance and manipulation. I needed an expert, someone who could navigate the treacherous waters of the legal system and turn Richard's own complexity against him. I didn't want a flashy downtown lawyer from a glass tower. I needed someone seasoned, someone who understood the quiet, vicious cruelty of elder financial abuse. I spent 2 full days at the library, not reading novels, but poring over the local bar association's directory and searching online for attorneys specializing in estate law and financial fraud. I made a list of names and spent another day making calls. Many of them were dismissive, their paralegals promising a call back that I knew would never come. They heard 70-year-old man and likely pictured a crank with a flimsy complaint. Finally, I found him. His name was Samuel Davies. His office wasn't in a skyscraper, but in a modest old brownstone. His website was simple, his biography direct. He was a former prosecutor who had spent the last 20 years in private practice, focusing on what he called fiduciary litigation. When I called his office, he answered the phone himself. "Davies," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. I explained my situation in a few brief sentences. I didn't embellish. I just stated the facts. The power of attorney, the missing funds, being kicked out of my home. I expected the same brush-off I'd received from the others. Instead, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. What was your name again?" "Arthur Penhaligon," I said. "Mr. Penhaligon," he said, and there was a new note of interest in his voice. "Can you be at my office tomorrow morning at 9? The next morning, I put on my best suit, the one I had saved for my old life. It felt strange to wear it, like putting on a costume. But as I knotted my tie, I felt a sliver of my old self returning. This was me, Arthur Penhaligon, a man who took things seriously, a man who showed up prepared. Mr. Davies's office was exactly what I had hoped for. It was lined with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, groaning under the weight of thick legal volumes. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and pipe tobacco. He was a man who looked to be about my own age, with a shock of white hair, a face etched with the lines of 1,000 different stories, and eyes that were startlingly sharp and intelligent. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "All right, Mr. Penhaligon," he said, gesturing to a worn leather chair opposite his massive oak desk. "Tell me everything. Start from the beginning, and don't leave anything out." For the next 2 hours, I talked. I laid out the entire sordid story, from Eleanor's death to the moment I walked out of Richard's house. I showed him the power of attorney. I handed him the thick stack of bank statements, with my red circles and angry notes in the margins. He listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, his gaze never leaving my face. He didn't take notes. He just absorbed it all. When I finally finished, the silence in the room was profound. He leaned forward, picked up the power of attorney, and examined it under the light of his desk lamp. "He got you when you were grieving," he said. "It wasn't a question. Classic vulture behavior. They circle until they smell weakness." He then spent a long time looking through the bank statements, his eyes scanning the columns of figures with an unnerving speed and precision. Occasionally, he would let out a low whistle or a soft grunt of disapproval. "He's arrogant," Mr. Davies said after a while, pushing the papers aside. "And sloppy. He thought you'd never check. He thought you'd just fade away into some state-run facility and die. The arrogance is what will destroy him." "Can you help me?" I asked, the question feeling small and fragile in the large room. He leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest, and looked me straight in the eye. "Mr. Penhaligon, I have spent the last 20 years putting men like your son-in-law in their place. They are parasites who feed on trust and affection. They are a special kind of poison. Helping you," he said with a grim smile, "would not be a job. It would be a pleasure." For the first time in a year, I felt a genuine surge of hope. I had an ally, a powerful one. Thus began my new life. My days were no longer empty. They were filled with purpose. Under Mr. Davies's guidance, I became a forensic accountant of my own life. We worked methodically, building our case brick by brick. He had me organize the bank statements into a master spreadsheet, a task that took me weeks. I spent my days in my small apartment, hunched over my laptop, tracing the flow of my life's savings into the black hole of Richard's greed. "We need more than just the bank statements, Arthur," Mr. Davies told me during one of our weekly meetings. "We need to show intent. We need to paint a picture of his lifestyle." This was the hardest part. It required me to become a spy. I couldn't risk being seen, so I had to be creative. I reactivated an old social media account under a false name, a generic profile of an older man with an interest in finance. Then I started following Richard, and Clara, and Julian, and all their friends. Their lives were on full display, a garish pageant of stolen wealth. There were pictures of the new sports car Richard had bought, a sleek black convertible. Photos from a lavish trip to Italy they had taken just months after I was kicked out, staying in 5-star hotels and dining at Michelin-starred restaurants. There was the new designer wardrobe Clara flaunted, the expensive summer camps for Leo, the constant stream of parties and social events. Every post was a fresh stab of pain, but I copied each one, documenting the date, the location, the estimated cost. I cross-referenced the dates of their extravagant purchases with the dates of the large withdrawals from my accounts. The correlation was undeniable. My money, the money Eleanor and I had saved for our old age and for our grandson, had paid for all of it. During this time, I maintained a strict silence. Richard and Clara tried to call a few times in the first few weeks. I never answered. They left voicemails. The first one was from Clara. "Dad, where are you? We're worried. Please call us." Worried they couldn't find me to serve me with an eviction notice, perhaps. The next one was from Richard, his tone laced with irritation. "Arthur, this is childish. Call your daughter. You're upsetting her." I saved the voicemails. They were evidence of their mindset. After a month, the calls stopped. As Mr. Davies had predicted, they assumed I had crawled away to die. Their arrogance was my greatest asset. They were so confident in their victory, so certain of my weakness, that they never once suspected what I was doing. They were living their high life, completely oblivious to the storm gathering just over the horizon. The only person I kept in contact with was Leo. It was a clandestine operation. I bought a cheap prepaid cell phone, a burner phone. I knew Leo's school schedule by heart. Once a week, on Thursday afternoons, when I knew he would be at the local park for an after-school program, I would call Clara's cell phone. She would be at work, and I knew Leo was old enough to answer his mother's phone. The first time I called, my hand was shaking so badly I could barely press the numbers. "Hello?" his small voice said. "Leo? It's Grandpa." There was a gasp, then an excited whisper. "Grandpa, where are you? I miss you." "I miss you too, buddy," I said, my own voice thick with emotion. "More than you know. Are you okay?" "Mom is sad a lot," he said, his voice dropping. "And Dad is always busy. He's not as fun anymore." We would talk for only a few minutes. I would ask him about school, about his friends, about the adventure stories he was reading. I would tell him I was on a long trip, but that I was safe, and I thought about him every day. I never said a bad word about his parents. He was an innocent in all of this. Those 5-minute conversations were both my greatest joy and my deepest pain. They were a lifeline to the love that still existed in my life and a constant, burning reminder of what had been taken from me, of what I was fighting for. After nearly a year of this quiet, meticulous work, the day finally came. I was in Mr. Davies' office, looking at the final product of our labor. It was a binder, a thick, black, 3-ring binder that was at least 5 inches thick. Inside was everything: the fraudulent power of attorney, the annotated bank statements, the spreadsheet detailing every stolen dollar, the printouts from social media, with receipts for cars and vacations that Mr. Davies had managed to subpoena from the companies, statements from a private investigator he had hired to discreetly confirm the ownership of Richard's offshore account. It was a comprehensive, irrefutable indictment of Richard's crimes. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Mr. Davies said, a flicker of pride in his tired eyes. He patted the binder as if it were a prized show dog. "It's a monument to a year of my life," I said quietly. "It's more than that, Arthur," he replied, his voice serious. "It's a weapon, and it's time to use it. Are you ready?" I looked at the black binder. I thought of the lonely nights, the sting of betrayal, the sound of Leo's small voice on the phone. I thought of Eleanor, and the life we had built, and the man I used to be. "Yes," I said, my voice resonating with a certainty that left no room for doubt. "I'm ready." The next day, Mr. Davies sent a single formal letter via courier to Richard and Clara's address. It was a masterpiece of understated menace. It did not threaten or accuse. It simply requested the pleasure of their company at his office the following week to discuss the final disposition of Arthur Penhaligon's assets and estate planning. The trap was set. Now, all I had to do was wait for the arrogant, greedy mouse to walk right into it. The week leading up to the meeting was the longest of my life. A part of me feared Richard would get spooked, that he would hire his own high-powered lawyer who would find a way to bog us down in legal maneuvering for years. But Mr. Davies had been confident. "He won't," he'd assured me. "His ego won't let him. He thinks you're broke and beaten. He'll assume you're coming to beg for scraps or to formally sign over what little he thinks you have left. He'll want to be there in person to see you crawl." He was right. 2 days after the letter was sent, Mr. Davies received a call from Richard himself. He accepted the meeting time. Mr. Davies told me Richard's tone had been one of bored indulgence, the sound of a busy, important man deigning to grant an audience to a lesser being. On the morning of the meeting, I woke before dawn. I did not feel nervous. I felt a strange and profound calm, the kind that comes when you know you are about to do something that is both necessary and right. I put on the same suit I had worn to my first meeting with Mr. Davies. It felt different now. It was no longer a costume. It was my uniform. I arrived at the brownstone an hour early. Mr. Davies was already there, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. He gave me a sharp, appraising look. "You look ready, Arthur." "I am," I said. We didn't speak much. We sat in his office, the thick black binder sitting in the exact center of his desk like a holy text. It seemed to have its own gravitational pull, a repository of truth and consequence. We waited. At precisely 10 o'clock, his receptionist buzzed. "They're here." A moment later, they walked in. Richard led the way, of course. He was wearing an expensive-looking gray suit, his hair perfectly coiffed, a look of supreme self-satisfaction on his face. He radiated an aura of power and impatience. Behind him was Clara. She looked tired, her face etched with a permanent worry line between her brows. She was thinner than I remembered. She saw me, and her eyes widened for a fraction of a second. A flicker of something. Guilt? Surprise? Before she looked away, focusing on a spot on the carpet. And trailing behind them, like a court jester, was Richard's nephew, Julian. He had a smirk on his face, clearly here for the entertainment, to witness the final humiliation of the old man. "Arthur," Richard said, his voice booming in the quiet office. He didn't offer to shake my hand. He just nodded curtly in my direction, before turning his full attention to my lawyer. "Mr. Davies, Richard Sterling, let's get this over with, shall we? I have a tea time at 1, and I'd hate to be late." He exuded the confidence of a man who believed he held all the cards, unaware that the deck had been stacked against him for a year. Mr. Davies gestured for them to sit in the 2 leather chairs, facing his desk. Julian remained standing by the door, arms crossed, looking smug. My chair was positioned slightly to the side, allowing me a clear view of all of them. I was an observer at the dissection of my own life. "Thank you all for coming," Mr. Davies began, his voice calm and professional. He let the silence hang for a moment, forcing Richard to lean forward slightly, a subtle shift in the balance of power. "As my letter stated," Mr. Davies continued, "we are here to discuss the disposition of Mr. Penhaligon's assets." Richard let out a short, humorless laugh. "Assets? What assets? With all due respect, I think we both know Arthur's financial situation is modest. If he's looking for a handout, I'm afraid he's come to the wrong place. We've done enough." Clara flinched at his words, but said nothing. Her silence was as damning as ever. Mr. Davies didn't react to the jibe. He simply reached out and placed his hand on the black binder. "On the contrary, Mr. Sterling, Mr. Penhaligon's assets were, until recently, quite substantial, which is what we're here to talk about." He opened the binder. The sound of the ring snapping open was unnaturally loud in the tense room. He turned it to face Richard and Clara. The first page was a simple 1-page summary. At the top, in large, bold letters, it read, "Summary of misappropriated funds." Below it was a single number, $487,652.38. Richard stared at the number. His smug expression didn't vanish, but it faltered, like a flickering light bulb. "What is this? Some kind of joke?" "I assure you, Mr. Sterling, I have very little sense of humor when it comes to grand larceny," Mr. Davies said, his voice taking on an edge of steel. He flipped to the next page. It was a copy of the Durable Power of Attorney. "Perhaps you recognize this document. You had my client sign it on August 14th, 3 years ago, under the guise of settling his late wife's estate, a moment when he was, shall we say, not in a position to be scrutinizing legal documents." Richard's face began to lose its color. "He gave me that authority. He asked me to manage his finances." "Indeed," Mr. Davies said, flipping another page, "and here is how you managed them." What followed was a slow, methodical execution. Mr. Davies turned the pages one by one, a grim rhythm marking the deconstruction of Richard's world. He showed them the first unauthorized transfer. $20,000 on February 5th. 2 days later, records show you made the down payment on a new jet ski. A coincidence, I'm sure. He flipped the page. Another $30,000 on May 12th. The following week, you and Mrs. Sterling flew first class to the Bahamas. We have the hotel receipts. He looked at Clara, who had shrunk down in her chair, her face ashen. He went on and on. The car, the vacations, the transfers to the personal offshore account, complete with the account number and the bank's location in the Cayman Islands. He presented the social media posts next to the corresponding bank withdrawals. The evidence was overwhelming, a tidal wave of meticulously documented proof. With each page, Richard's composure crumbled further. His confident posture sagged. A sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. He started shifting in his seat, his eyes darting from the binder to Mr. Davies, to me, looking for an escape that wasn't there. Julian, by the door, had lost his smirk. He now looked like a frightened child who had wandered into the middle of a war zone. The final blow was the section on Leo's college fund. "And this," Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping to a low, condemnatory tone, "is perhaps the most egregious. $100,000, earmarked for your own son's education, transferred in a single lump sum to your holding company, and subsequently lost in a failed bid to corner the market on some obscure biotech stock." At the mention of Leo, Clara finally broke. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She looked at Richard, her eyes wide, with a horror that was slowly curdling into rage. "You told me that money was safe. You told me it was in a trust." "Quiet, Clara," Richard hissed, his voice a desperate whisper. But the dam had broken. The power in the room had not just shifted, it had undergone a tectonic reversal. Richard, the king in his own mind, was now a cornered animal. I, the harmless old man, sat in silence, watching the man who had destroyed my life be utterly and completely dismantled by the simple, undeniable power of the truth. The air crackled with the silence of his ruin. He looked at me then, his eyes burning with a desperate, pathetic hatred. He had nothing left. The silence that followed Mr. Davies's presentation was absolute. It was the silence of a vacuum, of a world suddenly devoid of excuses. Richard sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the armrests. His face was a mask of disbelief and fury, his carefully constructed world lying in shattered pieces on the desk in front of him. Clara was weeping openly now, her shoulders shaking, her hands covering her face as if to block out the ugly truth. Julian had flattened himself against the wall by the door, trying to become invisible. Richard was the first to break. He shot to his feet, knocking his chair backward with a loud clatter. "This is a lie, all of it. It's a fabrication," he roared, his voice cracking with desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "He's a senile old fool. He's confused. He gave me permission for all of it. He was grateful for my help." Mr. Davies did not flinch. He remained seated, the picture of calm authority. "Permission, Mr. Sterling? Did he give you permission to gamble away his retirement on speculative stocks? Did he give you written permission to fund your vacation to Italy? Because if he did, I'm sure you wouldn't mind showing it to us." "This is a shakedown," Richard yelled, his face turning a blotchy red. "He's trying to ruin me. After everything I did for him, I gave him a home, I fed him, and this is the thanks I get?" "You gave him a home?" I spoke for the first time, my voice quiet but carrying across the room with the weight of a year's worth of suppressed anger. "The down payment for that home came from the sale of the house I shared with my wife for 45 years, a fact you seem to conveniently forget." My voice, so calm and measured, seemed to enrage him further. He took a step toward the desk, his hands clenched into fists. "You ungrateful old parasite." "That's enough, mister," Davies said sharply, his voice cutting through Richard's tirade like a whip. He stood up, not with aggression, but with an immense, unshakable authority. "Sit down, Mr. Sterling. Shouting will not make this binder disappear." Richard glared at him, breathing heavily, but some primal instinct for self-preservation seemed to kick in. He knew he was in the presence of a man who held his entire future in his hands. He slowly, reluctantly, sank back into his chair. "Mister," Davies let the tension simmer for another long moment before he continued. "We have two paths forward from here," he said, his tone now cold and clinical. "Option 1 is the civil path. You will sign a legally binding confession of your actions. You will sign over the deed to your house to Mr. Penhaligon, as it was purchased primarily with his capital. You will then agree to a structured repayment plan for the remaining balance of the stolen funds, which we have calculated to be $212,000 after accounting for the equity in the home. It will be a significant portion of your salary for a very long time. In return, this matter remains private." He paused, letting the terms sink in. Richard stared at him, aghast. "You want my house?" "I want my client's house back, mister," Davies corrected him. "And then," there is option 2. He tapped the thick black binder. Option 2 is that a copy of this entire binder, along with a sworn affidavit from my client, goes directly to the district attorney's office. Grand larceny, multiple counts of fraud, financial abuse of the elderly. A prosecutor would have a field day with this. And given your recent appointment to the City Planning Commission, I imagine the press would also find it quite compelling. You'd lose your job, your reputation, your freedom, your choice. The threat hung in the air, potent and absolute. The mention of the press and the DA was the final nail in his coffin. The fight drained out of Richard completely. He slumped in his chair, a broken man. The arrogance, the bluster, the rage, it all evaporated, leaving behind a hollow shell. He looked old and small and pathetic. Clara, who had been listening through her tears, finally looked up. She looked past her husband, her gaze fixing on me. Her face was a wreck of shame and regret. "Dad," she whispered, her voice raw. I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know about the money. I just thought." "You thought what, Clara?" I asked, my voice devoid of heat, filled only with a deep, weary sadness. "You knew he was kicking a 70-year-old man out of his home, your own father. You stood there in the dining room, and you let him do it. You didn't say a word. You chose his new office over me. The money is just details. You failed the simplest test of love there is. That was enough." My words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She recoiled, a fresh wave of sobs racking her body. There was no defense against the truth. Mr. Davies slid a set of documents across the desk toward Richard. "This is the confession and the property transfer agreement. I suggest you read them carefully and sign." Richard stared at the papers as if they were his own death warrant. For a long moment, he didn't move. I could almost see the gears turning in his head, searching desperately for an angle, a loophole, an escape. But there was none. I had spent a year closing every possible exit. With a hand that trembled visibly, he reached for the pen. His signature, usually a confident, flamboyant scrawl, was a spidery, hesitant mark. He signed away the house. He signed away his future earnings. He signed away his pride. He pushed the papers back across the desk without a word. He rose to his feet, avoiding everyone's eyes. He walked toward the door, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Clara got up to follow him, but she paused and looked back at me one last time, her eyes pleading for something I could not give her: forgiveness, absolution. I just held her gaze, my expression unchanging. I was not her judge, but I would not be her comfort either. She had made her bed. As they reached the door, Julian, who had been silent and terrified throughout the ordeal, scurried to open it for them. Richard paused on the threshold, his back to me. "You've ruined me," he said, his voice a choked whisper filled with venom. "No, Richard," I replied, my voice steady. "You ruined yourself. I just held up the mirror." He flinched as if I'd struck him, and then stumbled out into the hallway, Clara and Julian trailing in his wake like attendants at a funeral. The door clicked shut behind them, and they were gone. The silence that descended on the office was different now. It wasn't heavy or tense. It was light. It was the silence of a fever that has finally broken, of a storm that has passed. I stared at the door they had just walked through, and a wave of exhaustion so profound washed over me that I felt my bones might dissolve. I let out a long, shuddering breath, a breath I felt like I had been holding for an entire year. My shoulders, which had been hunched with tension for so long, finally began to relax. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees and burying my face in my hands. There were no tears of victory. There was no surge of triumph. There was only a vast, empty, and profound relief. Mr. Davies came around the desk and placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. "You did it, Arthur," he said softly. "It's over." I looked up at him, my old friend, my champion. "Thank you, Samuel," I said, my voice hoarse. "Thank you for everything." "Don't thank me," he said with a wry smile. "I told you it would be a pleasure." And it was. We sat there in the quiet office for a long time, the black binder resting on the desk between us, a silent testament to the battle that had been fought and won. In the weeks that followed, The consequences of that day in the lawyer's office rippled through Richard and Clara's life. Mr. Davies handled the transfer of the house deed. The legal machinery moved with an impersonal and inexorable force. Richard and Clara were given 30 days to vacate the property. The house that had been the symbol of their status and my humiliation was now mine again, in name and in law. The financial repercussions were severe. The repayment plan Mr. Davies had drafted was aggressive. A significant portion of Richard's income was garnished and automatically transferred to an account for me. The sports car was repossessed. The country club membership was canceled. Their entire world, built on a foundation of my stolen money, crumbled. Though we had kept the matter out of the courts and the papers, a scandal of that magnitude cannot be truly contained. Whispers started. Richard abruptly resigned from the City Planning Commission, citing personal health reasons. They moved out of the grand suburban house into a small, cramped rental apartment, the kind of place Richard would have openly sneered at a few months earlier. Friends stopped calling. The dinner party invitations dried up. Their social circle, which valued success and image above all else, shunned them as if they carried a contagious disease. Their fall was as swift as it was brutal. Mr. Davies kept me updated with periodic phone calls. "Their marriage is not surviving the stress," he told me one afternoon. "The combination of financial ruin and her discovery of his deeper deceptions, it's a potent poison." He was right. About a month after they moved out, Clara left him. The final betrayal, learning that he had gambled away their own son's future, was a blow from which their relationship could not recover. One evening, my phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. I answered cautiously. "Dad?" It was Clara. Her voice was thin and broken, a pale imitation of its former self. "Clara," I said, my own voice neutral. Can I see you?" she asked, her words punctuated by a muffled sob. "Please, just for a few minutes. I'm not with him anymore. I'm on my own." A part of me wanted to say no, to sever the final tie and protect the peace I had fought so hard to win. But I heard the desperation in her voice, the sound of my own daughter hitting rock bottom. I was her father. Some instincts are too deep to ignore. We met at a quiet, neutral coffee shop, halfway between her new apartment and my old one. She looked terrible. She was gaunt, with dark circles under her eyes. The expensive clothes were gone, replaced by simple, worn jeans and a faded sweater. She looked like a ghost of the woman she had been. She cried as she spoke, a long, rambling confession of guilt and regret. She told me how Richard had manipulated her, how he had convinced her that I was a burden, how he had framed the finances to make it seem like they were struggling under the weight of supporting me. She admitted she had been weak, that she had been seduced by the lifestyle he offered, and that she had closed her eyes to the cruelty she didn't want to see. "I was a coward, Dad," she wept, her coffee growing cold in front of her. "I know that. I was a terrible daughter. I don't expect you to forgive me. I needed you to know that I am so sorry." I listened patiently without interruption. I didn't offer comforting words or false reassurances. When she was finished, a heavy silence fell between us. "I believe that you are sorry, Clara," I said finally, and I was surprised to find that I meant it. "And I'm your father. A part of me will always love you." A flicker of hope lit up her eyes. "So, can we fix this? Can I be your daughter again?" I took a deep breath. This was the moment to set the final boundary. "No," I said gently but firmly. "Not now. You have to build your own life now, Clara. A life based on honesty and strength, not on shortcuts and willful ignorance. You need to learn to stand on your own 2 feet, without a man like Richard to lean on, and without a father to rescue you. You need to do this for yourself and for Leo." Her face fell, but she seemed to understand. The hope was replaced by a quiet, sad acceptance. "What about Leo?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "He misses you so much." "Leo is my grandson," I said, my voice softening. "He is an innocent in all of this. My fight was never with him. You tell him his grandpa loves him, and that I'll be calling him very soon. He and I will be just fine." I stood up. "Take care of yourself, Clara. Maybe one day, when you've found your own strength, We can try again. But for now, we both need to heal." I left her there, sitting alone in the coffee shop. Walking away was one of the hardest things I had ever done, but I knew it was the right one. It wasn't an act of punishment. It was an act of love. The tough, painful love that allows a person the space to find their own redemption. I had closed the door on the past, firmly and finally. It was time to start building my future. A few months passed. The seasons turned. Autumn arrived, painting the city in hues of gold and crimson. I moved back into the house. My house. The one Richard had defiled with his greed and arrogance. At first, it felt strange, like walking onto a stage set after the play has ended. The ghosts of the last few years were everywhere. I could almost hear Richard's booming voice in the hallway, see Clara's worried face in the kitchen. So I began the work of reclaiming it. I opened all the windows, letting the fresh, crisp air chase out the stale memories. I hired a crew to dismantle the absurdly extravagant home theater and the beginnings of the wine cellar in the basement. I converted the space back into a simple, clean workshop, just like the one I'd had in my first home with Eleanor. The scent of sawdust and wood stain began to replace the smell of new paint and ambition. I spent my days in the garden. Eleanor's roses had been neglected, but the roots were strong. I pruned back the dead wood, tilled the soil, and gave them the care they had been missing. Slowly, miraculously, they began to thrive again. New buds appeared, promising a future bloom. My life found a new rhythm, a quiet, peaceful one. It was a life of simple pleasures. The first sip of coffee in the morning sun, the satisfaction of a well-made joint in my workshop, the smell of damp earth after a rain shower. The silence in the house was no longer lonely or tense. It was calm. It was mine. And my life was not silent for long. As promised, I reconnected with Leo. Clara, to her credit, facilitated it. She would drop him off on Friday evenings, and he would stay with me until Sunday. Our reunions were joyous. We fell back into our old routines, but they felt new and precious now. We read adventure stories. We worked on small projects in the workshop, building birdhouses and model airplanes. I taught him how to care for the roses, just as Eleanor had taught me. One Saturday afternoon, we were in the garden, planting new bulbs for the spring. Leo, his hands covered in dirt, looked up at me with his bright, serious eyes. "Grandpa," he said, "are you ever going to leave again?" I stopped what I was doing and looked at him, my heart aching with love for this little boy who had been through so much. I pulled him into a hug, dirt and all. "No, buddy," I said, my voice thick. "I'm not going anywhere. This is our home. I'm here to stay." I had gotten my justice. I had reclaimed my home and my security. But watching Leo dig in the dirt, his face a picture of concentration and happiness, I realized my true victory was not what I had taken back, but what I had preserved. I had preserved this chance to be a grandfather, this chance to pass on the simple, decent values that Eleanor and I had lived by. I often think about the whole ordeal now, usually in the quiet evenings when I'm sitting on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky. I learned a hard lesson at 70 years old. I learned that kindness without boundaries is not a virtue. It's an invitation for exploitation. I learned that trust must be earned, not given away freely, even to family. But I also learned something more profound. I learned about the resilience of the human spirit. I learned that there is a core of strength inside of us that we often don't know exists until we are tested. Being pushed to the brink, being stripped of everything, didn't destroy me. It revealed me to myself. It forced me to become the man Eleanor always knew I was, a fighter. Standing up for myself wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of profound self-respect. It was a declaration that my life, my work, and my legacy had value. It was my way of honoring my wife, of protecting my grandson, and of reclaiming my own dignity. The world is full of Richards, men and women who see kindness as weakness and trust as an opportunity. They move through life with an insatiable appetite, consuming the goodwill of others to feed their own fragile egos. They believe they are clever, that they are winning, but their victories are hollow, and their foundations are built on sand. True wealth isn't found in a stock portfolio or in the square footage of a house. It's found in your integrity. It's in the love you give and the respect you command, not through fear or manipulation, but through the simple, unshakable decency of your character. That is the only inheritance that truly matters. It's the only legacy that can never be stolen, squandered, or signed away in a moment of weakness. It is the lesson I paid a high price to learn, and the one I will spend the rest of my days passing on to my grandson. And that is a victory that no amount of money can buy.